2025 Constitutional Amendment Bill proposes lower threshold for presidential election victory. Good evening, and welcome to BAV Inside Salone. I'm Ahisatu Kamara Kargbo. Tonight, we turn our focus to a proposed constitutional change that could fundamentally reshape how political power is won in Sierra Leone, and by extension, how democratic legitimacy is defined in our country. At the center of this debate is the 2025 Constitutional Amendment Bill, a bill that proposes lowering the threshold required for a presidential candidate to win outright in the first round of elections. What the bill proposes: a major shift in electoral rules. Under the proposed amendment, Sierra Leone would repeal the long-standing requirement that a presidential candidate must secure 55% of the national vote to be declared winner in the first round. Instead, the bill introduces a new formula under Clause 42(2)(e). A candidate would be declared elected if they secure a simple majority of total valid votes nationally and at least 20% of valid votes in 2/3 of the country's districts. If no candidate meets these two conditions, a runoff election would then be triggered between the top contenders. On the surface, this may appear to streamline the electoral process, but when we look closer, the implications are far more complex and potentially destabilizing. Why civil society is raising the alarm. Legal experts and civil society organizations, including the Institute for Legal Research and Advocacy for Justice, ILRAJ, have raised serious concerns about the bill's democratic consequences. Their core argument is simple but powerful. Lowering the threshold weakens the mandate of the presidency. Dropping from a 55% requirement to a simple majority, especially when paired with a minimal 20% district spread, could allow a president to be elected with narrow national support, deepening political polarization rather than healing it. Even more troubling is the reverse possibility. A candidate could win the highest number of votes nationwide, yet still lose the presidency because they fall short of the district distribution requirement, even when districts have unequal populations. This, critics argue, undermines the democratic principle of one person, one vote. Deviation from the tripartite consensus. ILRAJ also points out that the bill deviates sharply from Recommendation 53 of the Tripartite Committee, a body established to guide constitutional reform through broad political consensus. The Tripartite Committee had recommended a more balanced approach, 50% plus one vote nationally, and at least 25% of the vote in half of the districts for a first-round victory, with a clearly defined and limited runoff mechanism. Instead of strengthening legitimacy, critics say the proposed bill lowers the bar, without adequately safeguarding national cohesion or electoral credibility. As ILRAJ bluntly put it, democracy needs a president with both broad appeal and a robust mandate. Africa-wide comparison: how Sierra Leone stacks up. To understand why this matters, we must zoom out and look across Africa. In Nigeria, a presidential candidate must secure a majority of votes nationwide and at least 25% of votes in 2/3 of the states, a formula designed to force national outreach beyond ethnic or regional strongholds. In Kenya, the Constitution requires 50% plus one vote nationally and 25% in more than half of the counties, again emphasizing both numerical majority and geographic legitimacy. In Ghana, while there is no district spread requirement, the strict 50% plus one rule ensures that no president is elected without majority consent. Across these democracies, the principle is consistent. The higher the office, the stronger the mandate must be. Sierra Leone's proposed model, a simple majority plus a minimal district threshold, would place the country at the lower end of democratic safeguards on the continent. The risk of disputed elections and political instability. Ilraj warns that vague district thresholds and uneven population distribution could create fertile ground for disputed election outcomes, prolonged legal battles and runoffs, challenges to presidential legitimacy, heightened political tension in an already polarized environment, and history, both in Sierra Leone and across Africa, shows us that elections perceived as unfair rarely end at the ballot box. They spill into the courts, the streets, and sometimes into violence. Ilraj's recommendations: a path toward consensus. Rather than rejecting reform outright, Ilraj proposes constructive amendments to strengthen the bill. Require 50% plus one vote nationally. Mandate at least 25% of votes in 2/3 of districts. Introduce population-weighted adjustments so smaller districts do not override majority will. And, crucially, expand stakeholder consultation to build national consensus and reduce post-election disputes. These recommendations aim to balance inclusivity with legitimacy, ensuring that any president elected commands both numerical support and national reach. Why this moment matters for Sierra Leone's democratic future. This debate is not just about percentages. It is about what kind of democracy Sierra Leone wants to be. Do we want a system that prioritizes speed over legitimacy, or one that demands broad consent before granting the highest executive power? At a time when trust in institutions is fragile and political divisions run deep, lowering the bar for presidential victory carries long-term consequences that extend far beyond the next election cycle. And as this bill moves through Parliament, the critical question remains unresolved, a question that will shape Sierra Leone's political trajectory for decades to come. The political context: why this bill is emerging now. As we continue, it is impossible to separate this proposed constitutional change from the current political climate in Sierra Leone. This bill is not being introduced in a vacuum. It comes at a time when electoral credibility, institutional trust, and constitutional integrity are already under intense public scrutiny following recent elections and governance disputes. For many Sierra Leoneans, especially young voters and civil society actors, the question is not simply what the law says, but why the rules are being changed now and who ultimately benefits. Across Africa, sudden or poorly consulted electoral reforms ahead of future elections often raise red flags. From constitutional tinkering in Guinea and Uganda to electoral law changes in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, history shows that procedural reforms can quickly become political weapons if not grounded in broad national consensus. Mandate versus maneuver, a dangerous line. Supporters of the bill argue that lowering the threshold could reduce the cost of elections, prevent prolonged runoffs, and deliver quicker political stability. But critics counter with a sobering reality: efficiency must never come at the expense of legitimacy. A president elected on a narrow margin, under relaxed thresholds, risks governing from a position of political vulnerability, constantly fighting legitimacy battles instead of focusing on national development. In fragile democracies, perception matters almost as much as legality. Even if a president wins under the letter of the law, a weak mandate can paralyze governance, embolden opposition resistance, and deepen ethnic or regional divisions. This is precisely why constitutional thresholds exist, not to complicate democracy, but to protect it from narrow capture. The district spread problem: numbers versus people. One of the most controversial aspects of the proposed Clause 42.2e is the 20% district spread requirement. On paper, it sounds inclusive. In practice, it raises difficult questions. Should sparsely populated districts carry the same blocking power as densely populated ones? Can a candidate with overwhelming urban support be denied victory by marginal district shortfalls? Does this formula unintentionally privilege geography over citizens? Il-Raji's warning is clear. Districts are not equal in population, and failing to account for this reality risks distorting the will of the majority. This is why population-weighted safeguards exist in many electoral systems, to ensure that representation reflects people, not just administrative boundaries. Lessons from Africa, when thresholds are too low. Across the continent, countries that lowered electoral thresholds without adequate safeguards often faced post-election crises. In some cases, presidents were elected with less than 45% of the vote, only to spend their entire tenure battling protests, court challenges, and legitimacy claims. By contrast, countries that maintained clear majority thresholds, even when runoffs were costly or politically tense, tended to emerge with stronger executive authority and clearer democratic closure. This is why Ghana has repeatedly accepted second-round elections as the price of legitimacy, and why Kenya embedded strict constitutional criteria after its own history of disputed elections. The lesson is blunt, but necessary. Democracy is cheaper than instability. The role of Parliament. Rubber stamp or guardian of the Constitution. This moment places an enormous responsibility on Parliament. Lawmakers must decide whether they are simply passing legislation or shaping the democratic future of the Republic. Il-Raji's call for expanded stakeholder consultation is not procedural noise. It is a constitutional safeguard, broad dialogue involving political parties, civil society, traditional leaders, legal experts, and the diaspora could transform this bill from a point of division into a moment of national alignment. Without that consultation, any amendment, no matter how legally sound, risks being viewed as politically engineered rather than democratically earned. The youth question, a generation watching closely. Perhaps the most overlooked stakeholder in this debate is Sierra Leone's youth majority. Young voters are increasingly skeptical of political reforms that appear elite-driven, opaque, or disconnected from everyday struggles, unemployment, cost of living, education, and opportunity. For them, constitutional amendments are not abstract legal texts. They are signals of whether democracy is expanding or shrinking. Lowering presidential thresholds without strong legitimacy safeguards may send the wrong signal to a generation already questioning whether their votes truly shape outcomes. What comes next? A crossroads, not a conclusion. As this bill advances through legislative processes, Sierra Leone stands at a constitutional crossroads. The choices made now will determine whether future elections produce presidents who govern with confidence and consent, or leaders who begin their tenure under a cloud of dispute. And as citizens follow this debate, at home and across the diaspora, one truth remains unavoidable. How leaders are elected shapes how they govern and how nations endure. Which brings us to the next critical question unfolding quietly beneath the surface of this debate: whether constitutional reform in Sierra Leone is becoming a tool of democratic consolidation or a recurring instrument of political advantage. Constitutional reform or political engineering? The question many are afraid to ask. As we push further into this debate, a harder and more uncomfortable question begins to surface. Is this amendment driven by democratic reform or by political calculation? Across Africa, constitutional amendments that alter electoral thresholds often emerge at moments when ruling parties reassess their electoral math. That reality does not automatically invalidate reform, but it demands a higher standard of transparency, consultation, and justification. This is precisely why constitutional scholars caution that process matters as much as content. A well-intentioned reform, introduced without broad consensus, can still damage democratic trust. In Sierra Leone's case, critics argue that the speed and framing of the bill risk reinforcing public suspicion that electoral rules are being recalibrated to fit future political outcomes, rather than to strengthen democratic legitimacy. The silent stakeholders, diaspora, traditional leaders, and women. One striking feature of this process so far is who has not been meaningfully heard. The Sierra Leonean diaspora, a critical economic and political constituency, has historically played a role in constitutional debates, particularly on governance and electoral integrity. Yet many diaspora groups say they were not adequately consulted on a reform with such far-reaching implications. Traditional leaders, who often act as stabilizing forces during elections, also remain largely absent from the formal discourse, despite the fact that district-based thresholds directly affect their communities. And women's groups, long advocates for inclusive governance, warn that lower legitimacy thresholds often shrink political space, making it harder for women candidates and reformists to compete in polarized environments. Democracy, as many remind us, is not only about winning elections. It is about who feels represented in the rules that govern those elections. Regional standards and international norms. Regionally, bodies such as ECOWAS have consistently emphasized that electoral reforms must be inclusive, consensual, and implemented well ahead of elections. Similarly, the African Union's governance framework stressed that changes to electoral laws should enhance public confidence, not diminish it. While the 2025 constitutional amendment bill may meet procedural legality, critics argue that legitimacy is not conferred by legality alone. It is earned through trust, predictability, and shared ownership of the process. This distinction matters because electoral disputes rarely hinge only on what the law says, but on whether citizens believe the law is fair. The economic angle: why markets care about election rules. Often overlooked in constitutional debates is the economic consequence of electoral uncertainty. Investors, development partners, and multilateral institutions closely monitor constitutional reforms, particularly those affecting executive legitimacy. A president perceived as weakly mandated may struggle to push through difficult economic reforms, negotiate debt restructuring, or enforce fiscal discipline. In countries where electoral rules are frequently altered, policy continuity suffers, and economic confidence erodes. For Sierra Leone, which continues to navigate inflationary pressures, debt sustainability challenges, and donor-dependent fiscal space, political legitimacy is not a luxury, it is an economic asset. Runoffs are not the enemy, instability is. Supporters of the bill often frame runoff elections as expensive, divisive, and disruptive. But comparative evidence suggests that well-managed runoffs often strengthen democratic closure, giving winners a clearer mandate and losers fewer grounds to contest legitimacy. The real danger lies not in runoffs themselves, but in rules that attempt to avoid them at the cost of democratic clarity. As one constitutional analyst put it, a delayed mandate is better than a disputed one. Public trust, the currency democracy cannot print. At its core, this debate returns us to a single fragile commodity: public trust. Trust in elections, trust in institutions, trust that rules are not being rewritten mid-game. Once lost, trust is far harder to rebuild than any constitution is to amend. And this is why Il-Rajah's insistence on population-weighted safeguards, higher national thresholds, and broader consultation resonates beyond legal circles. It speaks to a deeper anxiety within the country that democratic erosion rarely arrives overnight, but through small technical changes that gradually lower expectations. The moment before the decision. As Parliament deliberates, Sierra Leone stands in a moment of quiet consequence, not yet at crisis, not yet at consensus, but balanced between two futures. One path leads toward clearer mandates, stronger legitimacy, and electoral rules that unify rather than divide. The other risks normalizing thin victories, contested authority, and recurring post-election tension. Outcomes that history shows are difficult to reverse once institutionalized. And as this conversation continues, in Parliament, in courtrooms, in communities, and across the airwaves, the question remains unresolved, hanging deliberately in the air. What kind of presidency is Sierra Leone designing for its future, and who gets to decide the rules that define it? The responsibility of leadership, lawmaking with history in mind. As we bring this conversation to its final stretch, it is important to remind ourselves that constitutions outlive governments, parties, and political careers. Those who sit in parliament today are not merely legislators of the moment. They are custodians of a democratic inheritance that future generations will live with, long after current political rivalries have faded. Across Africa, some of the most destabilizing crises did not begin with coups or protests, but with incremental constitutional changes that slowly weakened legitimacy thresholds, diluted consensus, and normalized rulemaking driven by short-term political advantage. The danger is rarely obvious at first. It often emerges years later when contested elections become routine, trust collapses, and institutions struggle to command obedience. Sierra Leone still has an opportunity to choose restraint over expediency and consensus over convenience. Advice to African citizens: democracy is not self-defending. To African citizens, especially young people and first-time voters, this debate carries a wider continental lesson. Democracy does not erode only when soldiers take power. It erodes when citizens disengage from technical debates, assuming they are elite matters. Electoral thresholds, district formulas, and constitutional clauses may sound abstract, but they directly determine whose voice counts, how leaders are chosen, and how power is constrained. Citizens must demand transparency and public consultation on constitutional reforms, reject last-minute rule changes tied to electoral calculations, defend majority rule alongside minority inclusion, understand that silence today often becomes regret tomorrow. A vigilant citizenry is the strongest firewall against democratic backsliding. Advice to African leaders: legitimacy is stronger than power. To African leaders in government and opposition alike, the lesson is even clearer. Winning power is not the same as earning authority. History shows that leaders elected with clear majorities and broad geographic support govern more effectively, negotiate reforms more confidently, and leave more stable legacies. Lowering electoral thresholds may secure short-term victories, but it often produces fragile mandates, permanent legitimacy disputes, governance paralysis, and reputational damage at home and abroad. True leadership resists the temptation to game the system and instead invests in rules that are fair even when you lose. That is the mark of democratic maturity. Final summary. Key messages from this debate. As we close, here are the core takeaways from tonight's discussion. The 2025 Constitutional Amendment Bill proposes lowering the presidential victory threshold from 55% to a simple majority plus a 20% district spread. Civil society groups, including ILRAJ, warn that this could weaken presidential legitimacy and distort the principle of one person, one vote. The bill deviates from Tripartite Recommendation 53, which proposed stronger safeguards, 50% plus one nationally and 25% district thresholds. Comparative African experience shows that stronger thresholds reduce post-election disputes, while weaker ones increase instability. Electoral legitimacy is not a technical luxury. It is a political and economic necessity. Constitutional reform without broad consultation risks being seen as political engineering rather than democratic progress. Sierra Leone still has time to amend, consult, and align reforms with best practices across Africa. A final word from inside Salone. Democracy is not perfected by lowering expectations. It is strengthened by raising standards. The presidency is the highest expression of the people's will, and it must rest on clear consent, broad appeal, and unquestioned legitimacy. The choices made today will echo into future elections, future governments, and future crises, or future stability. And as Sierra Leone debates this amendment, Africa watches, not just for what the law will say, but for what values it will ultimately defend. This has been BAV Inside Salone. The future of democracy is not decided only at the ballot box. It is decided by the rules that govern that ballot. As Sierra Leone debates this constitutional amendment, the stakes could not be higher, not just for one election, but for generations to come. If you value in-depth African analysis that goes beyond headlines, like this video, share it, comment with your views, and subscribe to the Bold African Voice. Together, we amplify Africa's voice, boldly, critically, and truthfully.